Do you think that any of the depth or the fragrance that comes through you, or the not the realization, but the way you express it, or something about it has anything to do with the suffering that you experienced in your life beforehand? It, you remind me of one of the Christian mystics, strangely. Uh, But the Christian mystics largely, their realization, deepest realizations were born of a certain suffering, maybe because of the times or the persecution or the trouble, but there's always trouble. Life is trouble. S- Does that resonate with you?
Yes, I would say that not for everyone.
No.
It's not a sort of formula or equation, but for many, perhaps because of the times we live in, the karmic cycles that we are in, yeah, suffering of some kind must or often does, not must, but often does come to a crescendo, to a peak, in order for something to almost shift its allegiance, to either question the nature of suffering, not from a personal point of view, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with my life, not from the victim identity or the me identity, but more from what is the nature of suffering, what is the cause of suffering, which is always the same mechanism, irrespective of what the seeming circumstance of suffering is. When we can really ask that question, that's one way in, which is deep inquiry, a deep looking within at those internal activities that create suffering. That's a shift in allegiance, because we're asking a different question to, oh, what's wrong with me and my life, and why do I suffer, and why do bad things happen to me, or bad things happen in the world, and what can I do about it? That's a different kind of question. So we're looking not to the periphery or the actual conditions, but to the actual
Go to
activity
the
within that actually creates the sense of suffering. So that's one way in. Uh, Another way in, and usually they go together, is that at the peak of suffering, whether it's the Christian mystics or myself or somebody else, um, we have, in some ways, a bifurcation point where we have a seeming choice. One is to um, become diminished or very contracted within that suffering, and the other one is to simply surrender, which means the same thing as the question that was asked: what is the nature of suffering? What is the activity? It's where the activity that perpetuates the victim identity and the contracted self comes to an end. So both of those sort of come together. One is actually an inquiry, the other one is an energetic shift. So for many, it needs to come to that point in order for something to shift, in order for the matrix of me self to begin to crack open or loosen or fall open. Up until that point, we as human beings tend to just go along in our default unconscious position paradigm of, this shouldn't be happening, I don't want this to happen, or I like this, or I don't like that, or I want this, or I don't want that, and this constant craving and aversion, and it's not examined. So at some point, something has to be examined, yeah, not intellectually, but by really looking within and sensing within. And so it's when that comes to a peak, then we have that possibility. It's the catalyst. So yes, I would say that was the case. Otherwise, we just go along with life trying to accumulate
Yeah, I
success
suppose you
and
would. Yeah,
possessions
I
and
suppose so.
relationships and love. And if we're okay with that, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But at some point, it's not the whole picture.
I think this is the sorry. I think this is the Eckhart Tolle reached that. He reached that within his own experience. That something intolerable, something was at crescendo point. Something was that there. The build up in a way to a certain necessity. Necessity. It was of necessity to him, and I think it was of necessity to you, maybe with a different language, different set of circumstances that they brought that on.
Well, yes, absolutely, because there were many conditions in my life and circumstances that you would say were traumatic or difficult or dark or whatever. But then the suffering continued after that. That was the that was the crescendo. It was like, well, nothing bad's happening. Actually, it's quite good on some level. I was pretty peaceful and happy, and it was, and I'd surrendered to what is, and it was all flowing in some ways, and I wasn't looking for anything or striving for anything. It was quite a peaceful flow of my life, and suffering was still there. So that was it's sort of, the suffering detached itself, if you like, unhooked itself from circumstance. And that allowed me to see or question,
Oh, I see. Right.
what is suffering? Why is there still psychological suffering when it's unhooked itself? It's not actually arising from a circumstance that's happened.
So does that mean, Carl, I've got to pursue this a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. So that means it unhooked from the story of your life, from being associated with experience. Yeah. So that was the first unhooking. And that first unhooking allowed you then, through grace or whatever, to ask a deeper, different question, which is, what is the nature of suffering itself? Not just what is the nature of my suffering with the history, etc., but to ask without it being an intellectual question, but it being a visceral, soul searching, deep dive question at the very core of existence itself. What is the
Yes.
nature of suffering?
That's right. And not relying on any theory, on any
Okay.
model, or any spiritual teaching, of which I had many. I was a psychologist as well. So I had hundreds of books on everything. Nothing esoteric, nothing metaphysical. It was like, without knowledge, without any prop, without anything to take me to the other shore, nothing, without knowing on that level, asking the question. It was a deep inquiry, and really just being totally open to either not knowing or something to be known, but not grasping for anything. I could have stayed in that question forever, if you like. That was
So
the
so
willingness.
Yeah, yeah, no, I get that. But with all your knowledge, this is a micro kind of looking at what was happening for you at that time when that question, what is the nature of suffering? You had enough experience. You're a smart person, with a lot of history of reading books. You could have gone to mind. You could have gone to knowledge because there are 1,000 books that might give you an insight into that, but you didn't. Why not?
Just-
Something else was calling you. You didn't. You
yeah,
you you
I think
didn't go to mind.
truth was calling. Truth in the sense of discovering what is true without knowledge. True direct experience.
Yeah.
That's one way of saying it. Another thing was that I was an experienced meditator. not in any
Ah,
particular technique. I wasn't following Zen or this or that or the other. I was simply sitting. I mean, I had done 1,000,001 different meditation techniques, but those I'd also kind of let go of as such. But I could sit in silence for a long time, and I did in various ways. And so I think that that allowed a clearer seeing of the internal movement of mind that actually creates suffering. And I do remember a very, very specific time where, after the meditation, there was this very subtle and very familiar sense of lightness and, yeah, lightness. And then that wouldn't last. And then there'd be this slight, so slight movement towards a little bit of melancholy, is the only way I could describe it. And it was so subtle, imperceptible. But I'd become very sensitive. And because I was living alone and actually didn't have any external distractions, I was in solitude pretty much, other than living in a city and doing what one has to do to live in a city. But I wasn't
mm, mm,
working or
mm.
socializing, so I had a lot of solitary time. So I was very sensitive to these internal movements, and whether it was the years of meditation practice or energy work that I experienced, expansion and whatever, I became very sensitive
Yes.
to that. And I think that allowed me, together with the question, they weren't simultaneous, but around the same sort of time period, allowed me to see the nature of suffering, the movement
Yeah.
away from and towards a particular internal state, and how that created a victim identity in the sense that I was a victim of my internal state. Not a victim of life or somebody abusing me or that, yeah. A very subtle victim that I would say is universal. We're victims of the thought and feeling state because we identify with thought and feeling and states, experiences. And I just saw that so clearly.
And
And that
in the sea
allow, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, in the seeing of that which you've described so eloquently, in the seeing of that, you kind of somehow, not decided is not the right word, to not move.
Well, it
There
wasn't
was a
immediate. It wasn't
oh,
immediate. That's what I mean. It didn't happen just from that seeing. I saw that, and that perhaps allowed a certain pause or stillness to take place, a certain stop within the self that was craving an aversion or moving. Um, so that facilitated it, but it's only when, I don't really want to describe it again here, but it's only when at some point later, I don't know, a few weeks later, a few days later, a few months later, I don't remember, it all happened within a period of several months, I think. It's only when a very particular state visited me,
ah,
again, not dependent on anything that happened, I was just sitting there, but a particular state of inner desolation,
oh, yeah.
yeah, appeared, that those two things came together. What is the nature of suffering?
Ah,
And
I
being the victim of a state. And that allowed an absolute stop. And in that absolute stop, the self died into no thing and re-emerged as everything.